Hey everybody, this is Dan the Chess Enthusiast, and I'm back with another video looking at another chess opening. In this video we're going to look at a variation of the King's Gambit Accepted. The KGA is a classic opening known in all variations for tactical play from white and, if not played correctly, a swift defeat for black. There are many variations of the KGA, and we are going to cover them all in future videos, but in this video we're going to examine the Polerio Gambit, also called the Muzio Gambit. In the Polerio Gambit, white not only gambits his f-pawn, but also his knight on f3. In return for material disadvantage, white has many tactical possibilities and is able to open up lines against the black king. As in all KGA variations, black has to play sharply to avoid pitfalls and defeat. With that in mind, let's get started with the video. So we have pawn to e4, pawn e5, pawn f4, the King's Gambit. Black accepts the gambit, and we have knight out to f3, which is preventing the queen coming down to h4, checking our king and creating a lot of problems in the position. From here, black is going to play pawn to g5. White develops his bishop out to c4, and black pushes forward with g4. Now, in this position, we're very committed to sacrificing the knight on f3, because if we try to save the knight by playing something like perhaps knight out to e5, well, queen to h4 is a very, very strong move. Black is actually in this game going to be on the attack, and white is going to be on the defensive. So instead, in this position, what white is going to do is simply castle. Black is going to capture the knight, and white is going to recapture with the queen. And as you can see here, we've got a lot of pressure on this f7 pawn. We've got the bishop putting direct pressure on the f7 pawn here, and once this file opens up, we're going to have the queen and the rook bearing down on the f7 pawn. So from here, the best defense for black is actually going to be queen out to f6. From here, white can play e5 to try to open up the e file. Black will capture with the queen, and in this position, there are actually two moves that you will see. In one of the main lines, the move is d3, which is protecting this bishop here and also opening the dark square bishop up to this pawn on f4. However, a much more common move in this position nowadays is bishop to f7. Now, I am going to talk about this move in just a moment, but I do want to cover d3 just for the sake of being thorough. So from here, what we'll have is black developing its bishop to h6. We'll have the knight development to c3. Black will develop its knight to e7. We'll develop the dark square bishop to d2. Black will develop to c6. And from here, we'll have rook on a over to e1, which is attacking the queen. And here, the best position, in this position, the best move for black is going to be simply to save the queen and pull her off to f5. From here, we have a knight to d5. Now notice that this knight here is in a pin with the king and the rook sitting here on e1. So to get out of the pin, black is going to move the king over to d8. And from here, we'll have queen down to e2. Now, this position, we've got a lot of pressure on this open file here. We've got a lot of pressure on the pawn here on f4, and our pieces are very well coordinated. Black is lagging in development. It's not castled, and it can't castle for the rest of the game. The dark square bishop on c8 and the rook on a8 are not contributing at all to the position. This is going to be a very difficult position for black to play in. Just kind of messy. However, if we go back to this position, move 8 from white, as I said before, the most common move in this position nowadays is sacrificing the bishop and playing bishop captures on f7 check. Now, this is just a devastating move because by sacrificing yet another minor piece, white is able to draw the black king out and mount a deadly attack, and black is going to have a very difficult time defending. So let's see what happens. Once the king captures on f7, then we'll have pawn to d4 attacking the queen. But the queen is just going to capture that pawn and check our king. However, from here, instead of pulling the king to safety, we're going to develop our bishop to e3. Now, because this pawn is pinned to the king, this bishop is safe. and so black is going to have to save its queen. From here, the queen is going to come back to f6, and there goes the pawn on f4. Now, this is just a really, really difficult position for black to hold, because although black is up substantially in material, in fact 2 minor pieces completely, it's almost completely not developed. The only two pieces that it has developed in this entire game are the queen and the king. Whereas with with white, we have a castled position. We have a lot of pressure on this open file here. We're going to be able to develop our knight very quickly, and our rooks are going to be connected. This is going to be very, very difficult for black to defend. We'll look at a couple of variations that black might try, but as you will see, none of them really are going to work. One thing that you might see is maybe bishop to g7, and from here white is going to develop its knight to c3. Black will develop its knight to e7. We'll have a knight to d5 attacking the queen. We'll have an exchange of knights on d5, and after the queen goes to block the check on e6, we'll have a discovered check on by bishop to h6, and this is going to be very, very difficult. As I said, king to g6 is going to be checkmate. The queen will just come over to f6, and that'll be mate. If the king moves onto the e file, well, we'll just slide our rook over and pin the queen down, and even moving back to g8 isn't going to work very well, because after, in fact, let me just show you what that would look like. Because after we develop our after we develop our rook to e1, if black wants to, it can capture our queen, but from there it's actually just going to be checkmate, because once the rook comes to e8, the only way to block the check is with the bishop, and then there we go, checkmate. So that's one variation that you might see after, if in this position black plays bishop to g7. Another variation that you might see is bishop out to c5, checking the king. From here, white is going to simply save the king and play h1. From here, we'll have pawn to d6, which is opening up access for this light square bishop to get into the game. From here, we'll develop our knight to c3. Black might develop its knight to e7, and then from here we'll have knight to e4. And as you can see, this is also another very difficult position, because if you move the queen anywhere, you'll have a discovered attack on the king, and moving the queen somewhere, like for example, let's just say we have queen to e6. Well, after this discovered attack, there goes the rook sitting here on h8. So that's another really deadly position that white can create. And finally, one more variation that you might see is maybe developing the knight immediately to e7. From here, we'll develop our knight to c3. The queen might come to f5. We'll pull our queen down to e2. The king will go to e8 to avoid any sort of discovered attacks on the queen, and that would pin the queen to the king here. But from here, we'll have an attack on the bishop. An attack by the bishop on the rook, and a discovered attack on the queen here from the rook on f1. Obviously, you have to save the queen. And from here, actually, instead of capturing the rook on h8, we'll play a very strong move like rook to f6. The queen is going to have to find refuge here on g8, and we have two open lines into the king's position. We're going to be able to develop our rook very quickly. This is going to be a very difficult position for black to play as well. So that is why in all the modern games nowadays you will see bishop to f7. As you can see, it's as you've just seen, actually, it's a very, very devastating move. It creates a really, really big mess for black, and very good for white. So that's it for this video. Be sure to check the video that I'm going to make, or that I have made rather, on this opening played at high level. As I said in my last opening video, the center opening What I'm going to try to do is once I make a video on a specific opening, I'm going to try to find a game played by masters or high-ranking players displaying that opening and all of its strengths. And so definitely be sure to check out the Polerio Gambit played at high-level chess in a modern game here. So yeah, take care and see you next time.